Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. One of my research interests is gender-based violence, and most of the research and work that I've done on this has been in the World Bank's South Asia region. So my discussion, the points I'm making are going to be quite a bit skewed to that context in the countries in South Asia that the World Bank deals with in the region, which are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. But I do think there are very relevant lessons here for policy and also successful responses that are not necessarily coming from government in many countries and regions of the world. So as already discussed in this workshop, GBV is a significant risk factor for transmission of HIV, and alcohol and drug abuse itself is a significant risk factor for violence against women and children. All 8 countries that I mentioned have state-sanctioned legal protections for several types of violence that occur throughout the life cycle of girls and women in South Asia. When we studied this in our book, Violence Against Women and Girls, Lessons from South Asia, we also drew from Lori Heise's ecological framework of violence against women. The types of violence that are outlawed across all of these countries include female infanticide, child abuse, non-partner sexual violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and maltreatment of widows and divorced women. All of them did have, until 2 years ago, state-sanctioned legal protections against child marriage, but in 2017, Bangladesh passed a law called the Child Marriage Restraint Act, which allowed for special circumstances for parents to marry off their daughters under the age of consent of 18, but it essentially just makes child marriage legal again. Bangladesh has the highest rate of girls married by age 15 in the entire world. And in 2016, the most recent data that I know of for this measure is that the share of girls married under age 18 was 52%. And it's expected to rise again because of this new law. Other prevalent types of gender-based violence experienced primarily by women and girls are outlawed in most of these countries. Sexual harassment is prohibited in 6 out of the 8 countries. However, harassment in workplaces, and especially on public transportation, is alarmingly common. Among female public transportation users in Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, between 80 and 20% have experienced harassment, especially sexual harassment, while on this public transportation. In Bangladesh, even though there's a strong policy framework against sexual harassment, women working in the garment sector, which is where a lot of women who work in Bangladesh and earn money, especially in the formal sector, among those women surveyed, 52% had experienced harassment from supervisors alone. And as we've heard from earlier discussions, survivors of violence tend not to report for various reasons, and chief among these in South Asia is a lack of awareness that there are these rights, there are these laws to protect them from violence. According to demographic and health surveys in these countries, the percentage of ever married women who gave at least one reason to justify spousal physical abuse, so they think it's acceptable in cases of burning dinner, disrespecting parents-in-law, according to the husband, refusal to have sex. In Pakistan, more than 60% of adolescents, or children, young adults aged 15 to 18, believed this, and 50% of adults. In Maldives, nearly half of adolescents, and a little over a third of adults, and in Bangladesh, about a third of each, adolescents and adults. Most of these countries either have laws or their constitutions are clear also on women's right to economic empowerment, to be economically independent. And that is typically a protective factor against violence. In Bangladesh, for example, the constitution upholds women's right, equal right to men to inherit and also own land. And Muslim personal law itself, which is, of course, the religious law that would apply to the majority of the population, is also clear on daughters' right to inherit. 1/2 of the share that brothers inherit, but only 1 in 5 women inherit anything at all in rural areas. 13% of women own agricultural land compared to 70%. And interestingly, religiosity of the household is significantly and positively correlated with women's inheritance of any land at all. So it's actually, because there are these laws, civil and religious laws, that protect women's right to inherit and own property. It's actually customs, age-old customs, that a lot of literature says is based on communities being organized into tribes, and the practice of keeping land and resources in that tribe is to keep women from inheriting or taking any of it when they usually marry, if they marry outside of the tribe and go to the home of the natal home of their husband. So this is to say, we touched on this a little bit, it's not that laws don't work, it's that they're not nearly enough, especially when thinking of gender-based violence and violence against women and girls in particular in South Asian countries. So I think yesterday there was also a comment about being careful not to use the word culture too freely, just to say, well, there are these cultural differences. I do think we can talk about customs that, as I mentioned, sort of contravene laws, religious and civil, and explain why gender-based violence persists and pervades these societies despite their strong policy frameworks. So I want to touch on this just a little using Denise Kandayoti's definition of patriarchy. Men of these societies are founded on patriarchal systems, but not religious necessarily, but going back further to these tribal systems, which, according to this definition, provide men and boys with incentives to devalue women and girls. Under classic patriarchy, quote, girls are given away in marriage at a very young age into households headed by their husband's father. There, they are subordinate not only to all the men, but also to the more senior women, especially their mother-in-law. The extent to which this represents a total break with their own kin group varies in relation to the degree of endogamy in marriage practices and different conceptions of honor, unquote. So this dynamic actually promotes son preference in households, in part because girls are a cost, a significant cost in resources, time, care for families, and then upon marriage, they just leave. And according to the custom, they're part of the marital family and do not provide financial care resources when parents are older. Violence is often used as a punishment for perceived transgressions against patriarchal norms. In South Asia, family systems and societies typically designate men as providers, breadwinners in the household, and they are enforcers of women's obedience. Subservience of women is one of these norms, and that includes girls and women's expression of their own personhood, their own sexuality, and their right to be present as equal citizens in public spaces and workplaces. And I know a lot of this may sound very far-flung and off the mark when we think about the US or Western society, but it does make one pause, especially in this past week when we've seen so many state laws against abortion being passed. What is the society really thinking about controlling women, their sexuality, and their rights to make their own decisions and life choices? So when we talk about success stories in violence prevention, it's really important to think about responses, interventions that change the way communities and even societies think and behave. And in a lot of cases, this begins with the family. This is hugely challenging, of course. It's the long-term solution, but it's the essential solution because short-term fixes like sex-segregated public transportation are not the solution. Chief among these types of interventions are those that are, first of all, evaluated, so we know how well they worked, but they attempt to address the underlying value of sons and daughters. Conditional cash transfers, maybe some have heard of, have been used in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and now in some other countries in South Asia and around the world to keep girls in school. Education, as we know, is a protective factor against child marriage. An example of multiple efforts initiated by national and state governments in India use these conditional cash transfers to reward families for having girls, and they start as early as infancy. The family gets its first cash transfer with the birth of a girl child. And then there are subsequent cash transfers throughout the life of the girl until she reaches age 18 to 20, provided she's unmarried and is graduating from secondary school. Research suggests that the earlier in a person's lifetime that they can learn new scripts, such as new ways to think about how to resolve interpersonal conflict, how to think about girls and boys, men and women, masculinities and femininities, and what girls can be able to aspire to, what they should be able to aspire to. These types of things early in life, these lessons learned are more likely to change attitudes and behaviors in sustainable ways. And the book that was mentioned about women's economic empowerment in Bangladesh, we launched this 2 weeks ago, and we had some leaders of the women's movement in Bangladesh on the panel, and they said one of the reasons that gender-based violence perpetrated by young men and boys, even against girls and young women, is because they don't have alternative role models or these alternative scripts. They're not seeing them from their parents and certainly not from their grandparents. So girls are becoming more educated. They're becoming more independent. They're striving for a broad range of occupations that aren't traditionally female. And this seems like a transgression to these boys. So one of the success stories, it's small, although it's growing. It was started in India and has been piloted in other countries in South Asia and Africa, is called GEMS, the Gender Equity Movement in Schools. This is one of the few well-evaluated programs to address sexual harassment in schools. The GEMS program addresses attitudes about sexual harassment both inside and outside of schools, and within a broader aim of transforming attitudes and behaviors related to intimate partner violence, child marriage, and more broadly speaking, gender norms, which of course are at the root of this perpetuated and sustained prevalence of violence. I think GEMS is especially worth examining because of its success. It introduced very complex, creative, and participatory curricula to young boys and girls. And in some places, it's piloted on boys and girls as young as age 8. It's also noteworthy in that it engaged not only the young boys and girls, but also their mentors, teachers, school administrators, and facilitators, all of whom were encouraged to examine and deconstruct attitudes of violence in their immediate environments. Best of all, GEMS provides an opportunity for scale up throughout public school systems, and thus it could potentially reach a vast population of youth. I have more details on that program, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to go through another set of promising interventions. As already noted in the last panel, critical element of prevention programs is successfully engaging men and boys. And this can reduce acceptance of violence against women, girls, and other men. You can think about that, for one example, in the gang context. Impact evaluations of programs with young boys and men have shown that addressing gender equality beliefs early in life of boys and men can have important impacts on their attitudes and their behaviors toward intimate partner violence. Just to name a couple, quasi-experimental evaluations of the Yari Dosti and Engaging Men programs in India and the Hum Kadam program in Pakistan showed success in using innovative and interactive sex education with young men to transform their notions of masculinity and attitudes with intimate partner violence and other forms of violence against women. And the research on this, I need to give a shout out to ICRW and also to Promundo. This is similar to the approach of life skills programs to prevent child marriage that seem to work with girls early to empower them. Programs that target young men, young women, through life skills, for instance, all use a mix of sexuality education, life skills, sports, and some community engagement. Community engagement is critical, especially in these contexts where you have the laws, but they're not enforced, and they're not enforceable. And governments often can't afford to enforce these laws. It's very costly, and sometimes they also just don't know how to enforce them. So this is for the end of my comments, but I want to give a shout out to the importance of rigorous evaluated interventions and the need to fund these interventions long enough that the funding for the evaluation itself lasts long enough that there can be evaluation of results beyond the end of the program, because that's when we really see if behaviors have changed and tend to stay that way. Media campaigns have shown mixed results, but their success can depend on a variety of factors, including the mode of media communication. Television, actually, has been surprisingly effective when used as soap operas on cable TV. The persistence of messages is important, portrayal of independent roles for women, and new scripts, as I mentioned. The MENA campaign by UNICEF in Bangladesh, Nepal, India, and Pakistan used, and it did an evaluation using qualitative participatory techniques and some qualitative elements, and it reported some success in promoting the message of equality. Another cable TV sort of randomized program based on cable TV was a source of an experiment in India, and access to that media was significantly associated with reduced sun preference, and suggests that that was likely due to the portrayal in popular soap operas of women professionals and leaders, and thus challenged these traditional views of acceptable roles for girls and women. Enforcement of laws requires coordination among many actors and many levels. A lot of the interventions, evaluated ones especially, that we found for South Asia were funded by bilateral donors. They were often implemented by NGOs or civil society organizations. The laws themselves were used as a signal and a lever, but it was really the campaigns on the ground, such as ASHA, the Alliance Against Sexual Harassment in Pakistan, trying to enforce the law against sexual harassment, that really enforced this and helped communities learn about it, and employers and all sorts of other decision makers enforce the actual law. Improving women's economic empowerment is another avenue to improve the agency of women, in part through increasing their economic value to families and communities. And it's a little disheartening to think that the sort of effective argument is still based on an economic value rather than women's rights to be dignified, independent citizens of their own with equal rights to those of men. But these economic arguments seem to be the most effective, especially in convincing governments to spend money on policy and programming. So I won't go through examples. I can talk about them later if there's time. But these include building land and non-land financial assets through awareness raising among women in communities, especially rural communities, and turning them into advocates for women's inheritance rights. Mobile banking for savings and other accounts can get around mobility and time constraints on women in these countries who bear the lion's share of household responsibilities and may even be constrained to the household or near the household. And leveraging religious laws and involving local religious leaders. And then finally, important intervention, someone mentioned, this was mentioned in a panel yesterday, is an intervention to provide safe and affordable transportation to women. This is not only critical for their economic empowerment. Public transportation is the main mode of getting to work for women, especially low-income women. And then, of course, it's very important for them to be safe and have a lowered risk of violence when they're in public, whether that's being on the transportation, getting to it, or traveling on foot from transportation to work in other places. So I'll end there, again, with the plug for funding evaluations from, especially by bilateral donors, but I think country-specific private sector-based organizations like the Gates Foundation, Aga Khan Foundation in Pakistan, and Tata Foundation in India have all been fairly instrumental in moving the research and evaluation of programs forward so that we can have an evidence base with which to convince governments and communities. Thank you.